after my husband died, I was left to raise twin babies on my own. My parents refused to help. You made your choices. They told me, but my in-laws opened their home and stood by me through every sleepless night. Years later, I sold my horse ranch for $100 million. When my parents suddenly came back into my life, they expected gratitude. Instead, I gathered everyone together and revealed who was receiving the biggest gift from the sale. The moment my parents realized it wasn't them, their faces froze in shock. People asked me when I knew my family was never coming back for me. They expect me to say the porch. The porch is the obvious answer, the cinematic one. My mother stood behind her screen door in her good cardigan and explained to a widow of 11 days that adults handle their own mess, but that's not the moment. The moment came 8 years later on a Tuesday afternoon, standing in my own kitchen with a forwarded email open on my phone, reading my mother's own typing, words she never intended me to see. That was the day I stopped wondering whether they loved me and started understanding exactly what I was to them, a line item, an asset marked down but not written off, a door they had decided in writing to keep cracked. My husband died on a Tuesday in October. He was 28. I was 26. The tractor rolled on a slope heat, graded 100 times, and the hospital called at 11 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. I remember the time exactly because I was warming bottles and the microwave still had 11 seconds on the clock when I picked up the phone. They asked me to come in. They didn't say why. They never say why on the phone. And some part of you knows that the not saying is the saying. I drove 40 minutes with my hands at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock and my mind perfectly terribly blank. And I signed 3 forms at a counter and my signature came out steady, which felt like a betrayal of its own. A nurse asked if there was someone I could call. I said yes. I lied. Here is what the truth looked like that night. A lease ending in 19 days, $400 in checking, a life insurance policy my husband had kept meaning to set up and never did because we were ranch poor and young and certainly had time. People our age always think they have time. The twins were 13 months old, a boy and a girl. They had just learned to clap, and they clapped at everything that week, the dog, the rain, the funeral guests, and every time those 4 little hands came together, I had to leave the room. That night I sat on the kitchen floor between 2 ribs and did the math out loud, because saying numbers kept me from saying anything worse. Rent, daycare for 2, the truck payment, diapers in 2 sizes because the boy was bigger. I counted it twice and got the same answer both times, and the answer was no. Not tight, not difficult, no. I had exactly 2 doors left in the world. The first belonged to my parents, 90 minutes east, a brick house with a wreath on the door for every season and a porch light my mother left on as a point of pride, so the neighbors would know theirs was a house where someone was always welcome. I want you to remember that detail about the light. It matters later, and it matters now because I grew up under that light, believing it meant something. The second door belonged to my husband's parents, 40 miles the other direction on a struggling horse operation I had visited maybe a dozen times. People with a barn that needed a roof and a mortgage. My father-in-law never mentioned in front of company. I chose my parents. Door first. Of course I did. 26 years of training points you at that door. I loaded 2 sleeping babies into the car. At 8 o'clock in the evening, 11 days after I buried their father, and I drove east toward the porch light, rehearsing a speech I never got to finish. I should explain what I was to that house because it explains everything that came after. I was the useful one. My brother, 3 years younger, was the one with potential. I got the part-time job at 15, and the speech about responsibility and the quiet expectation that I would never need anything because needing things was for people with potential, and I was merely dependable. I told myself for years that this made me the strong one. It took me until my 30s to understand that they hadn't raised me strong. They had raised me cheap. I knocked. My mother opened the inner door and stood behind the screen, and she did not unlatch it. I asked for 3 weeks, a couch, a corner of the basement, anything just until the insurance question sorted itself out, and I could find my feet. I told her the babies were asleep in the car, and they were good sleepers, that I would be invisible, that I would cook and be gone before she knew it. My father hovered in the hallway behind her and looked at his shoes. My brother's bedroom door cracked open at the top of the stairs, a strip of light his face in it, and then the strip went dark and the door clicked shut. He was 23 years old. My mother folded her arms across her cardigan and told me the family was stretched in, that 2 babies was a lot to take on, that I had made my choices when I married a dirt poor rancher, and that adults handle their own messes. And then she said the sentence I would carry like a stone in my coat pocket for the next 8 years. We can't be your safety net. We have to think about your brother's future. The baby stirred in the car behind me. The porch light buzzed above my head. I said, okay. That's all I said, because what else is there? I carried myself back down the steps, and somewhere between the second step and the driver's door, the porch light clicked off behind me. She didn't even wait until I was out of the driveway. The light the neighbors were supposed to see, the light that meant someone was always welcome, went dark, with me still standing under it. I didn't cry until the county line. At the county line, there's a gas station, the old kind with 2 pumps and a bug light. Pulled in because my hands were shaking too hard to drive. Then I called the only other number I had, my mother-in-law. I want to be precise about this because the precision is the whole point. I did not ask her for anything. I had just spent the last of my asking on a porch 90 minutes east, and it had cost me something I didn't have a name for yet. I called her to say I was struggling. That was the entire message. I'm struggling. I don't know what to do. She listened for maybe 20 seconds. Then she said 5 words. Where are you right now? I told her the gas station off the state route, and she said, don't move. And the line went dead. And 40 minutes later, my father-in-law's truck pulled in beside mine with its headlights washing over 2 sleeping babies. He was 61 years old, and he had buried his only son 11 days earlier, and he got out of that truck without one word and started transferring car seats like he had done it 1,000 times. My mother-in-law came around the passenger side carrying a quilt, blue, stitched with white stars, the one she had made when the twins were born. She wrapped my son first, and then my daughter, right there, under the fluorescent canopy lights, tucking the corners the way you do when your hands have done it for 50 years. Then she pressed something into my hands. It was warm, a casserole dish, chipped on one corner, the color of a marigold, foil over the top, still hot, like she had taken it straight off the stove on her way out the door. I started to say I couldn't, that I didn't want to be a burden. I got about 4 words into it, and she cut me off the way only a genuinely kind woman can, gently and completely. She looked at her husband over the truck bed and said, set 2. More plates. They're ours now. 7 words, no conditions, no speech about choices, no committee meeting about the family being stretched thin. 7 words in a gas station parking lot, and I followed their tail lights 40 miles into the dark, and I know it yet, but I had just met my real family for the first time in my life. Their place was 80 acres of good intentions and bad luck. A barn that needed a roof before the next hard rain. A mortgage with 18 months of patience left in it. A number I wasn't supposed to know and learned anyway, because in a small house the walls keep poor secrets. They put the twins in my late husband's old bedroom under a ceiling still dotted with the glow stars. He'd stuck up there as a boy, and they put me across the hall. And for the first week, I mostly lay awake listening to horses move in the dark and trying to figure out what I had to sell to stop feeling like a charity case. It turned out what I had to sell was the one thing nobody in my birth family had ever bothered to learn about me. I had a degree in equine science, 6 years of night classes and double shifts at a veterinary clinic paid for entirely by me, finished 2 months before the twins were born. I knew bloodlines. I knew conformation. I knew the difference between a horse that was sound and a horse that simply hadn't broken down, yet which is a distinction that pays for itself exactly once and then forever. On my 9th day there, my father-in-law walked me through the stock, mostly to give me something to do with my hands, and I stopped cold at a stall in the back, a bay mare for years, old with a left front leg that turned in slightly at the knee. He told me she was going to the Saturday sale, that nobody wants a crooked-legged mare, that he couldn't afford to feed what he couldn't sell, and the sale barn would give him killer price, and that would have to be good enough. I stood at that stall a long time. Everyone who had ever looked at that mare had seen a flaw. I watched her take 3 steps across the straw, and I saw the flaw working. The way that turned-in knee let her get her hind end underneath her and load it. The way she pushed off a half faster than a straight-legged horse ever could. It wasn't a defect. It was a feature filed in the wrong drawer. I asked him to give me until spring. Then he looked back at me, and his face shifted, and he said, all. Right then, 1 season. She was the first thing I had chosen in 11 days. I want to be honest about who I was that first year, because it isn't a flattering picture, and I'm done pretending otherwise. I was not brave. I was terrified every hour of being a burden in the only house that had taken me in, and I converted that terror into work, because work was the one language I had ever been allowed to speak. I broke colts for neighbors at dawn. I drove a feed route midday with 2 car seats strapped in the back of a borrowed truck. My father-in-law offered me a wage from the operation in the 2nd month, and I refused it and kept refusing it for 4 months, because owing them anything more felt like a debt I could not survive defaulting on twice. My mother-in-law started leaving plates of food outside my bedroom door because I had stopped sitting down at the table, and she never once mentioned it, never made the plates into a conversation. One night my father-in-law found me asleep, standing up in the wash rack with the hose still running over my boots. He turned the water off, and he stood there a moment, and he said quietly, "Nobody is keeping score out here." I remember looking at him and genuinely not understanding the sentence. I had spent 26 years in a house where everything was scored. Love came with an invoice, attached, itemized, payable on demand. And you could not unlearn that in a season. It took me years to understand that working yourself to the bone is not always discipline. Sometimes it is just fear wearing a nicer coat. But here's the thing about fear, point to the right way it can build. The mare came along over 14 months, and I didn't fight that leg. I built around it, conditioned her to use what she had instead of apologizing for it, taught her to sink her hindquarters into the ground on her stops like she was pouring herself into the dirt. By the 2nd spring, she could stop on a dime and roll back faster than horses were 10 times what the sale barn would have given for her by the pound. I entered her in a small futurity too. Counties over, folding chairs, a concession stand that sold hot dogs and burnt coffee. We placed 3rd out of 41. I stood in the arena, dirt holding a green ribbon worth nothing at all, and I felt the first solid ground under my feet in over a year. But the ribbon was not the important thing that happened that day. The important thing was a woman in the 2nd row of the bleachers with a leather notebook who had been writing through every run and stopped writing during hours. She found me at the trailer afterwards and she asked me exactly one question. Where did you get that mare's bloodline? I told her the truth. I built it out of a horse headed to slaughter. She studied me the way I had studied the mare, like she was watching a law work. And then she handed me a card and said she would be in touch. I didn't recognize the name on the card. My father-in-law did. She came out to the place that February in a truck worth more than the bar and walked the fence line with my father-in-law for an hour and then asked to see the mare move. She watched for 10 full minutes without one word. Then she turned to me and said, "You read that like correctly," which most people with letters after their name would have missed. And now I want to know what else you can see. So I told her what I could see, that the mare's way of going could be heritable, that if I could prove the trait carried across all, there was a market that would pay serious money for horses that stopped like she did, that I had run the numbers on a foundation breeding program 100 times in the dark, and I knew the figure to the dollar. She asked for the figure. I gave it without flinching. She didn't flinch either. Then she said the words I had spent my clear as throat whole life learning to distrust. Let me invest in you. And I am not proud of this, but my first instinct standing in front of the best chance I would ever be offered was no, because I had learned what people meant when they offered to help. I had learned it on a porch in October under a light that went out. So I didn't say yes. I said I would need to see every term in writing, every line, reviewed by my own attorney, and this woman who could have walked away and funded any program in 3 states smiled like I had just passed an exam. She didn't tell me I was taking. I hired an attorney with money I did not have, a careful woman who charged me in installments and earned every dollar twice. We spent 3 weeks on that agreement, and I read every clause out loud at the kitchen table until the language stopped being a foreign country. The investor would fund the breeding program and hold a clearly defined minority stake with a clean buyout path. But there was one thing I dug in on, one thing my attorney said. Most people in my position never think to protect until it is too late. The bloodline itself, the genetics, the breeding rights, the registration, records, the future of that mare's line. All of it I kept structured separately in an entity that belonged entirely to me. She could have argued most investors would have. Instead, she read my red lines, looked up over her glasses, and said, "You're going to do just fine, aren't you?" She signed in blue ink on a Tuesday. I signed under her. When my attorney slid the executed copies into a folder, I felt something click in my chest like a foundation setting. I didn't fully understand yet why it mattered so much to me to own the thing, and not just a share of its income. I think part of me was still standing on that porch listening to my mother price me out of the family. Somewhere down deep I had decided I would never again be in a position where someone else held the paper that decided my life. The people who love you sign clearly. The people who use you sign in fog. The first foal hit the ground the next spring, a leggy bay colt who stood up wrong and then moved right. And within a week I knew he had it. The low-loading hindquarter, the hunger to stop. We named the program after the creek that ran the back of the property, and I bred carefully 3 mares the first year, then 6, matching the line to outside blood that complemented the trait. Instead of canceling it, when that first colt was a 2-year-old, he sold at auction for a number that made my father-in-law sit down on an overturned bucket and stay there while the money started slow, and then it stopped being slow. The foreclosure clock that had ticked in my chest like a second heartbeat for 2 years simply stopped. And one Sunday that fall I fed the ranch hands lunch off the back of a flatbed, ladling stew out of a chipped marigold casserole dish, the same one that had been pressed warm into my hands at a gas station. My mother-in-law caught me using it and didn't say a word. She just smiled and looked away. I had gone from the woman being fed in a parking lot to the woman doing the feeding, and I had done it out of the same dented dish. Through all of this, my parents called. Twice a year, Christmas and my birthday, like clockwork, like a subscription. Nobody remembered signing up for, and nobody bothered to cancel. I want to tell you about one of those calls, because it told me everything years before the email did. It was Christmas morning. The twins were almost 2, and they were tearing into secondhand gifts. My mother-in-law had wrapped in newspaper and ribbon, and the phone rang. And it was my mother. The call lasted 4 minutes. She spent the first 3 minutes on my brother, his new venture, a fitness franchise that was going to be huge, how proud they were, how he always had vision. Then with about a minute left, she remembered who she had dialed and asked how I was getting along. Out there at the in-laws, I said the kids were healthy and I had placed a horse at a futurity. Then she said, well, that's nice. And then she asked the question that I have never forgotten, not because of what she asked, but because of how she asked how the babies were doing. The babies, my children, were almost 2 years old, and my mother could not produce their names, not one of the two, because she had never once asked, and you cannot recall what you never bothered to store. I said their names slowly, like a correction, and she said, of course, and then my brother needed the phone, and happy holidays, and the line went dead. I stood in the doorway watching my daughter stick a bow on my son's head while my mother-in-law laughed from the kitchen, and I understood something with a clarity so complete it didn't even hurt. These people remembered my existence twice a year, and they had never learned the names of the only grandchildren they would ever have. I hung up the phone and went to set the table, and I put out 2 extra plates without being asked, because in that house that was simply what you did. Somebody might come hungry. You set the plates. The program grew past the county and then past the state. Buyers who had never returned my calls started leaving messages. The waiting list got a waiting list. People began saying the name of the program before they said my name, which was exactly how I wanted it, because the program had documents behind it, and I had learned to trust nothing else. And then one Thursday in March, 8 years after the porch, my phone rang, and it was my mother, and it was not Christmas, and it was not my birthday, and that is how I knew before. She said one word that something had changed. Her voice was different, warmer, rounded at the edges in a way I had not heard since I was small and useful. She asked how I was, and then she waited for the answer, which she had never once done in my adult life. She asked about the ranch, and she used the program's name correctly, which meant she had heard it somewhere, which meant it had traveled 90 minutes east. And then she asked about my children by name, both names in the right order. I stood in the tack room holding that phone and felt the strangest thing. Not warm, not hope, a cold, clean alertness. The kind you get when a horse you trust suddenly pins its ears at an empty doorway. Something is there. You can't see it yet, but the animal in you already knows. She said maybe she could bring the kids by sometime. That family shouldn't be strangers. That life was short. She said she had seen a thing online about a young woman and horses doing very well for herself, and it had just made her think of me. It had made her think of me. I said I'd see, and I got off the phone, and I stood there turning one question over and over like a stone. Why? Now, I didn't have the answer yet. It would arrive in about a month by accident in my inbox. My brother called the next week, because of course he did. Franchise had not in fact been huge. What I got on the phone was the charm, offensive, the easy laugh, the we've got to catch up, 10 full minutes of warm-up before he got to it. And when he got to it, he wrapped it so softly I almost missed the shape. He needed a bridge, just until the next location stabilized, and he hated to ask. But family helps family, and he'd heard I was doing real well out there with the horses. Then he said a number. It was not a small number. I let the silence sit the way you do with a green colt, not pushing, letting the pressure speak. Then I said calmly, I help people who showed up. You weren't there. Your door was the one I watched close. He got quiet and then he got cold and he told me I had always been dramatic and that family was supposed to forgive. I told him forgiveness and a loan are two different transactions and I wished him luck and I hung up and I went back to the barn where things made sense. The answer to why now arrived on a Tuesday. Dressed up as nothing. My brother forwarded me an email by mistake. He had meant to send it to my mother some logistics about a cousin's wedding, but his thumb caught the wrong contact, and underneath his new message sat the entire old thread scrolling back 6 years email does when nobody bothers to trim it. I almost deleted it. Then a phrase caught my eye because the phrase was my own name, and I scrolled. There it was, black and white, a conversation between my mother, my father, and my brother dated the spring after my husband died, months after the porch. My mother had written that taking me in would have been throwing good money after bad, that I had made my choices. Marrying a dirt poor rancher, that some people are just a bad investment. My father had replied agreeing, adding that they had to think about my brother's future. And then at the bottom in my mother's typing the sentence that hollowed me out and rebuilt me with something harder than anything I'd felt. At the funeral, we keep it civil. We don't burn the bridge completely. You never know. If the ranch ever amounts to something, we'll want the door cracked. We'll want the door cracked. 8 years of twice-a-year phone calls suddenly translated themselves in front of me. They had not forgotten me out of carelessness. They had filed me away on purpose, an asset marked down, a position held open in case it ever appreciated. The warm Thursday call was not a thaw. It was a quarterly review. The practice names of my children were not love arriving late. They were due diligence. I read it 3 times, standing at the kitchen counter, and I waited for the rage, and the rage did not cool me. What came instead was colder and far more useful clarity. I printed the email not for a lawyer, not for a lawsuit. I printed it so that on the inevitable future day when my mother stood in front of me being warm, I would never again be tempted to confuse what she was doing with love. I put the printout in the top drawer of my desk under the checkbook and I closed the drawer and I went back to work. I want to tell you I plotted some elaborate revenge that night. I didn't. What I decided instead was simpler and I think harder. I would not give them 1 hour of my anger. I would do the one thing nobody in that brick house had ever imagined I was capable of. I would outbuild them. I would make something so solid and so cleanly mine that when the day came that they reached for it, and that day was coming, I could feel it. Their hands would close on air. That was the entire plan. Build structure. Wait. You would think people who wrote off a widow in an email thread would have the decency to stay away. Mine did the opposite. As the program's name got bigger, my family discovered a sudden public devotion to me. My mother and brother showed up uninvited, found me at the trailers, and turned into a greeting card the second a camera swung our way. My mother hugged me for the photographer from the Regional Horse magazine. My brother told a reporter, loud enough to carry, that the family had sacrificed so I could chase the dream. I stood inside their performance like a fence post they were leaning on for the picture, and I understood what they were building because it was the mirror image of what I was building. I was assembling documents in an attorney's office, quiet and unwitnessed. They were assembling a story, loud and witnessed, a story of a close family that had stood by their girl through the hard years. They dealt an image they always had. My mother could make a room believe anything for her. The length of a photograph. Let them have the photograph. I smiled the correct amount and I filed the moment away in the drawer with the email, because I had already decided how this would end. They would build their version in public, and when the day came, I would answer it the only way. That beats an image with the truth out, loud in front of every person they had ever wanted to impress. There was one moment in all of it, exactly one that nearly cracked me open. It was my father. He found me alone at the back of the trailer lot, away from my mother, and he stood there working his hat brim in his hands, and his eyes were red, and he said, "I think about that night a lot." I waited. He said, "Your mother." And I fought after he left. Fight of our marriage. I sat in the truck at midnight with the keys in my hand, and I should have driven to you. I should have driven to you, and for one suspended. Second, I was 12 years old again, wanting so badly to believe that my father would have come. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. That was 8 years ago. Where are you standing now? He looked at the ground. The silence stretched, and in that silence, I got my answer more cleanly than words could have given it, because if you were standing with me, he would have said so. Instead, he said something about it being complicated, about your mother, about not wanting to choose sides. He had carried that confession for 8 years, gotten it halfway up his throat, and he still could not take one single step out of her shadow to act on it. I didn't hate him. That is the strange part. I just finally saw him all the way to the bottom. A man who would always feel the right thing and never once do it. The offer came when the twins were 9. By then the program was not a ranch anymore. It was a brand. The mayor's descendants stood in the best barns in the country, every one of them tracing back to a crooked-legged horse sale barn would have bought by the pound. A Western lifestyle company, the kind that owns competitions and clothing labels, and a streaming channel, had been circling for a year. One afternoon there, people sat across my own kitchen table from me and my attorney and slid a number across the wood. $100 million. Dollars for the land, the facility, the brand, and they were very clear about this part, the genetics, the breeding rights, the future of the line. I asked for 2 weeks to decide. They gave me 3. That night I walked out to the old mare's paddock. I leaned on the rail and thought it through. Selling meant the door was finally and permanently me. I already knew I would take the deal. The only question left, the question I had been quietly answering for 2 years already, was who I would open the door for. I knew before the ink was dry on the sale what the money was going to do, and I built it the way I built everything on paper, airtight. My attorney at my elbow, 3 structures. The first, an irrevocable trust for my son and my daughter, locked so tight that no charm, no lawsuit, no tearful holiday plea could ever buy $1 out. Ahead of schedule, they would be educated, secure, and free, and no one would ever stand on a porch pricing. The second was for my in-laws, the deed to the original 80 acres and the farmhouse signed back to them free and clear, plus an account funded to carry them in comfort for the rest of their lives, plus a real stake in the proceeds. Not a gift wrapped in obligation, just theirs. When I told my mother-in-law, she put down the dish towel and said, "Honey, you don't owe us a thing." And I said, "I know, that is exactly why." The third was the one that mattered most to me. A scholarship foundation in my late husband's name, funded for the long haul to help young people into equine science, with one specific reference written directly into the bylaws. Applicants raising children alone. I wrote that sentence myself. I made my attorney read it back to me twice, and I kept one living thing out of the sale. The only carve out the company agreed to at my insistence, a single filly from the old mare's last cross, written into the contract as retained, not for sale at any price. Bright bay, 1 white sock, a left knee that turned in just slightly, exactly like her dam's. Line would go On smaller now, just ours, in a paddock the kids could see from their bedroom window. Everything I did. In documents, because documents were the only language my family could not argue with. They dealt in feelings and photographs and the elastic memory of who did what to whom. I dealt in signatures, witnessed, notarized, recorded. By the time the sale was a month from closing, every meaningful dollar was already allocated to the people who had shown up in forms that could not be undone. I simply had not told the people who hadn't. It leaked. The way $100 million anything leaks, and my phone, quiet for years on the family front, came back to life like a thing possessed. My mother texted within 6 hours, so proud of. You always knew. My brother sent 3 messages and a 4th that was nothing but a row of celebration emojis, as if we had won something together. My father left a voicemail saying he hoped we could all sit down soon as a family, that he loved me. I stood in the kitchen, reading it all, and I heard her voice from the porch as clearly as if she were in the room. We can't be your safety net. Except now they could see the size of the net I had woven out of nothing, while they watched from 90 minutes away, and every one of them was reaching for it with both hands. I did not reply to any of it, not out of cruelty, because I had learned that silence is its own answer, and a perfectly clear one. Then my brother stopped asking and started telling. The next call wasn't soft. The charm was gone, sanded down to the raw, entitled grain underneath. And for the first time I heard my brother without the performance. He said the family deserved to be part of this, deserved. He listed things the way people do when they have kept a ledger in their own favor and never once shown it to the other party. And then he said the sentence that told me exactly how the end would go. He said, obviously we'll all be there for the celebration, and we should talk about what's fair. There was no question mark anywhere in it. He was not asking to be invited. He was informing me that they were coming and that a number would be discussed and that I would be unreasonable to refuse. In front of an audience, I had to admit, a smart play. It was the only play they knew, the leverage of a scene, the price of looking cold. My mother had taught it at the dinner table for 30 years. I told him I'd see him there, which he took as a yes, and which was not a yes. Then I called my attorney and told her I wanted every last document signed, witnessed, and recorded before the celebration date, not after. Before, when they came to negotiate, there would be nothing on the table left to negotiate. The table itself would already belong to someone else. My mother drove out 2 days before the event alone. She had not set foot on that land in the 8 years it took me to remake it, and she arrived in her good coat and stood in my gravel drive, looking at the new barn, the covered arena, the brass plate by the gate, and I watched her do the math behind her eyes. The same math she had done on the porch in October. Different total. She started warm. She always starts warm. She told me she was proud that she had always known I had it in me, that a mother knows when warm didn't move me. She shifted to grief, dabbing at eyes that were not quite wet, telling me how hard it had been to watch me struggle from afar, how she had cried for me, and when grief didn't move me either, she found the floor. She was actually standing on the one that had been under the warm the whole time. She said, after everything I sacrificed for you, going to embarrass this family in front of the whole county, there it was not love leverage, the threat of a scene, the cost of looking cold, the exact play. My brother had run because she was the one who wrote it. I did not raise my voice. I told her I had nothing to embarrass anyone with, that I was hosting a celebration for the people who built this place with me, and that the guest list reflected the build. She heard the shape of what I was not saying, and the screen door opened, and my mother-in-law came out without one word, lifted the blue star quilt off the porch swing and laid it around my shoulders against the evening cold. The Same quilt. 8 years of washings. Thin. Hands that had wrapped my babies. In a gas station parking lot, my mother looked at that quilt for a long moment. Whatever she saw in it, she did not have a name for. She got in her car and left. That night, I could not sleep, so I did what I always do. I went to the barn. The grounds were ready. A tent by the arena, chairs in rows, a small wooden stage, a banner rolled and waiting. 300 invitations had gone out in front and center to reserve seats for my in-laws who had grumbled that they did not need a bus and were getting one. Anyway, I had not invited my parents or my brother. The day belonged to the people who showed up, and there was no seat in that arithmetic for the people who hadn't. I sat on an overturned bucket in the dark with my speech in my head, and the young filly nosed at my sleeve through the rails, and her dam dozed in the next paddock over 2 ends of one line nobody had wanted but me. I had planned every word of the next day, down to the breath. What I had not planned, what I genuinely did not see coming, was that they would simply walk through the front gate anyway, the way you do when you have spent your whole life believing closed doors do not apply to you. The day came up golden still. By 11 o'clock, the lot was old. Trucks and trailers and the company's black SUVs lined along the vents, and close to 300 people drifted across the grounds with coffee and lemonade, talking horses and weather and the unbelievable thing the widow had built out here in the dirt. I wore a clean shirt and good boots and shook 100 hands. My in-laws sat in the front row by the stage, him in a tie. He visibly hated her with the twins on either side in their good clothes. My son fidgeting, my daughter solemn and proud. Everything was calm. Everything was exactly as I had built it. I stepped toward the stage with 3 pages of a speech I did not really need, and I scanned the sunlit crowd one last time. All the faces that had a hand in this. And that is when I saw them, my mother, my father, my brother, walking in through the front gate, dressed for a photograph, moving along the edge of the crowd like dignitaries at a ribbon, cutting, uninvited, smiling, right on time. They worked my people like a rope line. My mother had on a good coat and a smile she could hold for an hour without it cracking, and she stopped to introduce herself to strangers as my mother. You must be so impressed. We always knew. My brother drifted toward the little cluster of press, the regional magazine, a live stream camera, and I watched him lean toward a reporter and say, just loud enough to carry that the family had sacrificed everything to give me my start, that this was a story about what a family can do when it stands together. My father trailed behind them with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes found mine across the crowd, and then they slid away to the ground where they had always lived. They were not there to celebrate, they were there to be seen celebrating, to plant themselves inside the frame so that every photograph and every clip of the biggest day of my life would show them standing at my side, the loving family ode. My mother caught my eye over the heads of 100 guests and gave me a small, confident, proprietary wave, the wave of a woman certain her seat was being saved. A few to the neighbors who knew the rail story went quiet and still, the way a herd goes. Quiet when something walks the fence, a line that does not belong. My mother-in-law's hand found my daughter's shoulder. The investor raised one eyebrow at me, a question. I gave her the smallest shake of my head, not yet. I climbed the 2 steps onto the stage, and the crowd began to settle and turn, and my mother smiled out over all of it, like she had built the place herself, already arranging her face for the gratitude she was certain was coming. I set my pages on the podium. I found the front row, and I began. I did not raise my voice. I had promised myself that the night before on an overturned bucket in the dark, because the louder a thing is, the easier it is to argue with. I started soft, and 300 people leaned in to hear me, which meant that by the time I reached the part that mattered. The grounds were dead silent and straining toward every word I thanked them for coming. I told them the short version of the truth that 8 years ago I had arrived in this county with 2 babies and $400, and that the people who took me in never once asked what I could do for them. They just said 2 more plates. Then I said I had 2 gifts to give before anything became official, and that I wanted to give them out loud in front of everyone because the right people deserve to be thanked where the whole county can hear it was the foundation. I nodded, and the banner unrolled behind me, and there was my late husband's name, 20 foot tall in the October sun over a scholarship fund built to help young people into horses with a written preference for parents raising children alone. The crowd made that warm low sound a crowd makes when something lands square. And then the second gift, I asked my in-laws to stand. They did, confused, her hand going to her chest, him gripping the chair back, and I told 300 people what until that moment only an attorney and a county clerk knew, that the deed to this land, the original 80 acres and the farmhouse had been signed back to them, free and clear, recorded at the courthouse 3 days ago. There's forever, along with enough that they would never worry again, because 8 years ago they gave a stranger and 2 babies a home without asking one question, and you do not repay a thing like that. You can only spend the rest of your life trying to match it. My mother-in-law sat down hard and cried into both hands. My father-in-law stared at me, then at her, then took off his hat for some reason, the way men of his generation do when something is too large to keep a hat on for. The crowd came up off its chairs, and the applause rolled across the grounds like weather. And at the front edge of that standing, roaring crowd, 3 people did not move. My mother's smile was still fixed in place, but it had stopped meaning anything. It was just a shape now, frozen onto a face that was rapidly understanding it had brought the wrong expression to the wrong event. My brother had gone white around the mouth. My father stared at the stage like a man watching a train he had been assured would stop for him. I let the applause settle all the way down, and then, while 300 people were still on their feet and perfectly silent, I said there was one more gift, a small one, for family. I came down the steps with the envelope in my hand. The crowd parted without being asked. My mother's face was relighting itself as I came toward her, the smile finding its meaning again, because an envelope at the end of a day like this can only be one thing, and she knew what it was. She had kept the door cracked for 8 years for exactly this envelope. She took it. She thanked me graciously out of volume calibrated for the people around her, and she opened it right there in front of everyone because she wanted witnesses for the check. It was not a check. It was a single printed page, and I watched her eyes hit her own words and stop. The email. Her email, dated the spring after my husband died. She had spent 2 years telling reporters the family was sacrificing everything for me, throwing good money after bad. Some people are just a bad investment. And at the bottom, in her own typing, the sentence she could not look up from, if the ranch ever amounts to something, we'll want the door locked. The people nearest her were close enough to read it over her shoulder. I watched the reporter my brother had been beating all morning lean in, then look at my brother, then start writing. My father read it sideways and aged in front of me. My mother's hands began to shake the page, rattling faintly, the only sound in 300 people's worth of silence. I kept my voice low. The grounds were so quieted. Carried anyway, I said, you wanted the door clicked. There it is in your own words, so I know you'll recognize it. The ranch amounted to something. The door is closed. And I turned and looked at the front row, at the 2 old people, clutching a deed and a quilt and each other, and I said the only other thing I had planned, the sentence I had been carrying since a gas station parking lot 8 years before. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who showed up. My mother found her voice. It was not the warm one. It was the porch voice. 8 years older and twice as sharp, and it tore out of her in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. How dare you? How dare you humiliate your family? And there it was, complete. The inversion I had built for 2 years, without ever once raising my voice. The calm woman holding the documents and the loud woman holding the evidence against herself and her own typing in front of the county. My brother said something about lawyers. My father said nothing at all. He looked at me one last time, and the confession from the trailer lot flickered across his face, the thing he felt and would never do. And then he looked at the ground where he had always looked and let himself be steered toward the gate. My mother talked the whole way. Ow, after everything I did for you, after everything, her voice getting smaller as the distance grew, the page still crushed in her fist because she could not seem to let go of it until the gate closed and the word stopped. And 300 people slowly turned back to me, and the land went quiet. It was my land for 14 more days. It had never been more mine than in that silence. My mother-in-law reached out from the front row and took my hand. The twins piled into me from both sides, and somewhere behind us in the soft paddock past the arena, an old crooked-legged mare lifted her head at the noise, decided it was nothing, and went back to grazing.